here on our network, we're going to go through a number of things with a good friend of mine. I love Doug. He's an amazing colonel, Colonel Doug MacGregor, the hero of the Battle of 73 Easting. He's written several books, Breaking the Phalanx, which actually changed doctrine in DOD. I don't know how you feel about it, Doug, but they credit you for helping shape the Iraq invasion by your thinking in that book and the idea of modularization of the military, which I thought was a great idea. And obviously, you have a new book out, Margin of Victory, 5 Battles That Changed the Face of Modern War. We'll talk a little bit about that. Well, anyway, thank you for being here, Doug.
Sure. If I may, I would revise the introduction in one way.
Sure.
Say I'm the hero of the 73 Easting. There were 1,100 of us in the 2nd Squadron on the battlefield that day, and I would say there were certainly 1,100 heroes.
Yes, sir.
No mean the only one or alone. So it's important to keep that in mind.
Yes, sir. Oh, no, I agree, and I would encourage people to go out and check. I think the History Channel is a great, very accurate rendition of what happened. And
well, I also wrote a book about it. It's called Warrior's Rage.
Warrior's Rage.
And that was published, I think 2009 or 2010, somewhere in there. And, people might find it of interest. And a number of movie producers have expressed an interest in it. But I think it's a tough nut to crack right now. Yeah. But I think at some point it will be very interesting to people because it's a positive story about the U.S. military. And I think we could use those.
Right. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you know, Doug, I produced something called Chain of Command, which was done by Nat Geo, that basically my old friend Joe Dunford, General Joe Dunford, wanted us to actually show what the Pentagon was doing well during his time as chairman, which is out. And now we've been told we can maybe do a season 2 of that, which we're working on right now. So I'll keep you informed on that. So let me start our interview with a quote. Jonathan Parshall said in his keynote speech titled 1942, The Crux of War. This is what he said. Far fewer wars than one might think have outcomes that are actually preordained. Wars are conditional. Their outcome depends on a chain of events, each affected by ones coming before it and likewise those coming after it. So, Doug, is the outcome of the Ukraine conflict preordained?
Well, gosh, I think that historian's quote probably fits most descriptions of dating. I'm not sure it's very illuminating from a military history standpoint. When I wrote Margin of Victory and I picked 5 battles, I did it with something else in mind.
Yeah.
I was trying to demonstrate a couple of very important things that Americans absolutely do not understand. In fact, they're not alone, but I think it's a huge problem in the United States. One was, most battles, and for that matter, wars, are won certainly at least 10 to 20 years before they occur.
Right.
And that's a function of decisions that are made on organization, leadership, training, education, as well as technology, and how well you organize to exploit technology, which is something the U.S. Army does very poorly. The naval and air forces understand that everything for success in their worlds depends upon organizing to exploit technology.
Right.
We have lots of stupid people who say, well, we equip men. We don't turn it around and say we're manning the equipment. Well, they're wrong. The truth is, if you're successful, it's because you've manned it effectively. Right. You've altered your organization for combat in order to exploit technology that's new and different from what you had before.
Right.
The second part of this was what has profoundly changed. And the revolution that I was trying to get people to understand is really this revolution of indirect fire, or what you would call standoff attack, long-range strike. There are all sorts of names you can use for it. And how the emergence of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms, literally from seabed to space, linked to a whole range of long-range strike systems. And long-range, frankly, to me, as a soldier, means almost anything beyond my line of sight. Mm-hmm. All of that results in a profound way that changes the way you fight and organize to fight. And we really haven't come to terms with that. We still think in terms of long-range strike that comes from the Air Force or the Navy as augmenting our artillery. We don't see ourselves as part of this new paradigm. And that's playing out right now in Ukraine. One of the things that the Russians have done very effectively, and it's not surprising since they were the first after World War II to really see this, is that they have organized their ISR and tightly linked it to a whole range of strike systems from automatic mortars all the way up to tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and so forth, to the point where early in the campaign, there was a fight in and around Kharkov, and an apartment block was abandoned, and the Ukrainians went across the street into a mall and set up essentially artillery and fighting positions. When the word reached the Russians within 7 minutes launched a cruise missile from the Black Sea that targeted and destroyed that mall area with all of the Ukrainians in it. That all took 7 minutes. That's impossible in the U.S. military. And that leads you to a whole other discussion about unity of command.
Right.
Someone at every level, one person, one man is in command. We don't do that. We have multiple single service headquarters augmented to quote unquote cooperate and be joint. And they all fight over turf, access, their role, leadership, and so forth. The Russians how to do that infinitely better than we did.
So that's the thing. Look, I've come through the system. I enlisted in 81, was commissioned in 83. I can honestly say that other than going to spy school, going down to Camp Perry to become a spy, none of the education, professional education, ever related directly to what I had to do to be effective in combat. From going through officer basic. No, I'm completely serious. I mean,
look, I am not surprised. I agree with you. And one of the things that did not endear me to my superiors was that both during Desert Storm and afterwards, when I commanded at Fort Riley, the paradigm I adopted was tactical paradigm, battle drills, formations, and so forth, and integration with air power was really very German. Mm-hmm. And to a lesser extent, somewhat influenced at the time by Soviet practices. But I effectively abandoned whatever the U.S. Army was preaching, which was never quite clear to me. And as a result, we were successful in the desert in 91. And then the squadron I commanded set a record at the National Training Center, which once again did not endear me to anybody. We were the high performance unit in history. But it was because I simply did not do what the U.S. Army suggested because I never saw that it made any sense. So I agree with you completely.
Yeah, no, and you're credited widely for all of the doctrine and tactics you were able to come up with. But I had the same thing because when I went through officer basic as a second lieutenant, they made us jack of all trades, second lieutenants. We're supposed to know everything in MI. It's like that's stupid. And next thing I know, I'm doing chasing terrorists in Europe, doing things I was never trained to do. It's like you just got to go do it. You got to figure it out. And then same thing in Afghanistan. My book Operation Dark Heart, which I've talked to you about a little bit before. Doug, I was literally going to Command and General Staff College, literally the month before I deployed, learning air-land battle, knowing full well I wasn't going to do a thing regarding the FLOT or FIBA in Afghanistan. Yet I was required to know that to a great level of certainty because reasons, I guess. But it added absolutely nothing to my capacity to be effective in combat in that current war. And that's what it's like. We were now we would probably be well served to go look at the FLOT and FIBA issues if we're actually going to be facing a near-peer adversary, which now we're not. So it's just amazing.
The problem is, of course, that air-land battle was really obsolete when it was adopted.
Right.
It was essentially an attempt to replicate what the Germans did in the 1940s. There was some language from Soviet doctrine incorporated into the thing, deep battle, this sort of business. But it really wasn't what we needed at the time. But it was such a breath of fresh air compared with the nonsense that already existed that everybody celebrated it.
Right.
We need a fundamental reexamination of everything, not just in light of what we've seen happen in Ukraine, but you can speak also to this very well. You had access to overhead surveillance and a lot of information that frankly should be available today in most tactical formations.
Right.
There's a way to do that, but we haven't really done it.
Right.
And we, and one of the things that, well, you're saying that we should be like special operations. Well, in some ways, yes. And that was the point I made in Breaking the Phalanx,
Right.
because I thought they were headed down the right road. But, the sad part is nothing is going to change in the near term. But perhaps this experience in Ukraine will help us a little bit, because clearly things there are very different. You have a battlefield right now where the Russians sitting in southern Ukraine, and keep in mind they are inching incrementally forward every day. So if you look at the line of contact, 160 miles long, it continues to move north and west, albeit slowly, because they're operating in this tremendous sea of mud, which limits your mobility. But you have a situation right now, and I watched this the other day on a video. It was sent to me from Ukraine, and it showed a Ukrainian brigade dismounting to walk across the field, because if you stay on the roads, obviously they're identified. If you're on the road, you're going to be destroyed instantly. But the Russians, of course, found them. This is roughly about 6 to 10 miles in front of their defensive positions, or at least their perimeter. They identified where they were, and within 2 minutes, they were under effective strike from a variety of systems.
Right.
Again, rocket artillery, tube artillery, and so forth. The entire brigade was annihilated in a space of about 60 seconds. This is a different world from the one you and I entered in the Army.
Oh, I get it. No, Doug, I understand.
No, but I'm saying, when you entered the Army and the things that you were taught and the experience that you had, what I had in 91, I mean, I drove through artillery and had artillery shot at me, but what we're talking about is beyond that, in a magnitude that most Americans cannot conceive of, so that you can completely obliterate something, and you can do it because you are protected by layered air defenses. And that's what we don't have. We have no means of protecting ourselves from air and missile attack on the scale of the Russians.
Right. And I want to go through and kind of get to that and the nuclear issue as well. So to that point, and to your point, every major success we've had in combat came from a great deal of preparation, which I would argue with you, we're not there right now. Plan Orange. Back years ago, Tony Kukolo, Commandant of the War College, Tony and I sat down and how do we do what you're talking about? How do we try to figure things out ahead of time? And he wanted us to work on a Plan Orange of the 21st century. Doug, I went to Dunford, to Joe Dunford with this. Joe may not be happy with me talking about this, but me and my merry little team of rebels, to include Jim Woolsey and Bud McFarland and Dick Newton, Ambassador Hank Cooper, we all sat down and said, we need a grand strategy. And you know who vetoed that, Doug? You want to guess who vetoed the grand strategy?
No, I can think
of a guy named Mattis, James Mattis, said it was too hard to do. I'm not joking. It was too hard to do. It's like, what? We have this huge, most expensive military ever on the face of the earth, just kind of meandering around looking for things to do without a strategy. And so to me, am I missing? I mean, I know I'm only Lieutenant Colonel here, Doug, but am I missing something? To me, the strategy should be there. That's what we build from to build success. So, I mean,
well, truthfully, I would argue we've never done it. And if you go back to the Second World War, our performance in that war was not some brilliant achievement.
No, I agree.
And I don't blame people like Marshall for that, because he inherited something. He did the best he could. If you go all the way back to MacArthur as Chief of Staff of the Army, he tried to establish a system where he could identify talented officers. He created examinations, study programs. He wanted to turn the Staff College into something akin to the German War College. And he was obstructed throughout the entire time as Chief of Staff. And he was ultimately told, in an army of 250,000 or 70,000, we're lucky to find 20 or 30 officers who are ever going to meet the requirements that you've stipulated, General. And so, he left there. He had trouble just purchasing a couple of tanks for exploratory tactical exercises. So he had a lot of problems, but the situation didn't improve a lot. And by the time Marshall got there, he had to make virtue of necessity and do a lot of things quickly. And we lost a lot of people as a result of not being adequately trained and prepared. And, if you read it, there's a great book called Advance and Destroy, Patton and the Bulge, by a man named Ricards. And if your readers read that, they'll discover that Patton is always throwing up his hands because he says, I can't just run around and relieve people. There just aren't that many people who know what they're doing. It's
Right.
not their fault. We have not trained them. They're not educated.
Right.
And I think we have this sort of same complacency affects us now. And others, people tell me in the Navy, it's just as bad. It may be. I don't know. I always thought the Navy had an advantage because you still had to take the ship to sea, keep the water out and the people in. That required some degree of technical competence and brains. If you were in an aircraft, you still had to take off and land without killing yourself. So again, that was another IQ test. But we have nothing on the ground, nothing. And I think the generals like it that way. I really do, because that allows them to essentially pick and choose whomever they want and make them fellow members of the GO club. Remember, how many times have you heard, well, he's a real war fighter. That guy, we need him. And I would say, who the hell is this? What has he done? Well, he's probably married to someone's daughter who's a 4-star. It's absurd.
No, I've seen the way that general officers are picked, and the few I've worked with and I've respected, Tony Cuccolo, to mention one. Tony and I were in combat together. He seemed to not want to go along with a lot of the nonsense and was trying to break out of the kind of mundane, let's just kind of go along, get along. But that brings me to the next point, Doug, is this arrogance of culture. You just mentioned one form of arrogance. You have these general officers who presume to know, hey, this guy's better than another because, reasons. And we have this now infestation within our thinking at the strategic level at the Pentagon, not only Army, but the entire Joint Staff. And they're constantly projecting our values onto other cultures, especially regarding Russians. This constant messaging about, Tony Blinken and all these guys, well, they must be reacting this way. No, they're not going to react this way. And the dismissal of Putin's grievances constantly, like, we're just don't worry about that. Yeah, he's been saying the same thing for almost 20 years, but he doesn't really mean it. Of course he means it. And the level of complete detachment from reality is mind-boggling. I mean, I'm an intelligence officer. My job is to assess and make recommendations to how an adversary is going to do something or not do something so that we can then be there ahead of them. I don't know how many times, Doug, I've made cogent recommendations based on what the outcome is likely to be and ignored because, it doesn't meet our political framework. And that's my question to you. We seem to have not only this dismissal of reality for what it is because it doesn't match the narrative of the political class. I would argue people like Mark Milley, have become politicians in uniform. They're more concerned about their next job, their corporate position than they are actually doing their job. And in the case of Milley, I think he's almost become a Trotskyite. And my question to you is when he talks about white rage, is that because he's got hemorrhoids or does he actually have a legitimate claim to being a Marxist?
Well, I wouldn't want to guess and confirm the first option. But I suspect that he's just someone who's doing what he's done throughout his career. My experience on active duty taught me that the vast majority of people that are advanced to the rank of general officer are people that are go along, get along people that question nothing, that simply repeat whatever the boss says, and have this positive attitude that everything can be done and let's just work ourselves to death some more and the general will be a success. If he's a success, we're a success.
Yeah.
I don't know what you do about it unless you have a fundamental overhaul and change the people. Marshall said, I did not change the culture of the United States Army. I changed the people, and the people changed the culture. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we have to understand. And, I hate to say it, but I don't see much hope for most of the people at the top these days. And look, people respond to the incentive structure. They ask themselves, well, who's the success story? And if you're a young major who's ambitious, you look up and say, well, who made it to 4 stars? Well, you and I could sit here and say, oh, my God, those are some of the worst people I can imagine.
Right.
That's true. But from the standpoint of the major, he says, well, look at you. How far did you get? Why should we listen to you? I mean, listen, this is the sort of thing that goes on. It's the only time you get change is, when you have a real emergency, and that's what Marshall confronted. And he wasn't always right in the people that he picked. He couldn't waste a lot of time dwelling on who was perfectly qualified or not, but I'd say about 60 to 70% of the time he was right.
Right.
We came in late. We didn't have to fight for very long. We never faced the Imperial Japanese armies that were on the continent, which were on the whole much better than the troops we faced in the Pacific.
Right.
The Navy fell apart because we sank most of it in an attrition war that we fought. And so we got away with it in the Pacific. In Europe, it was a long, slow slog online, and we took a lot of casualties, and we covered it up. One of the things that you find out about the Bulge, we said, oh, the Germans had 200,000 casualties, and we had 70,000. When you look at the actual figures, just in the Bulge, the Germans had 11,000 men killed. 11,000 with some number of about 18,000 casualties total. And we, on the other hand, were at 78,000.
Wow.
With far more killed than the Germans. So, when in doubt, lie.
Yeah.
And we did. We lied a lot during the Second War. And Stimson, when the war was over, he wanted to conduct investigations against Eisenhower, against Bradley, a number of people. It was all dropped. And, I think it was Churchill that said about Montgomery, when you're winning, it can be said that anything you did was right.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, that's what we've had a problem with. Now, in Korea, Vietnam, things were different. And we didn't win.
Yeah.
And we didn't win, arguably, in Iraq, although I keep pointing out that people don't understand the futility and stupidity of occupation and trying to export democracy at gunpoint.
I'm with you on that.
And if you had gone in with a very narrow purpose and executed that and gotten out, nobody would give a damn what happened in Afghanistan or Iraq. But we didn't.
Right. No, I've said that about Afghanistan over and over. It's like we long overstayed our ability to actually influence things on the ground in a positive way. So next, Doug, to go into this real quick, it's back to Ukraine, because so much of what you said applies directly to what we're doing now in Ukraine. And I think there's a complete dismissal of the facts. Right now, we have spent, according to this little cheat sheet I've got, the table of U.S. aid to Ukraine, supplemental appropriations, $113.4 billion. It's a lot of money. And I would argue that's the strategy. Just throw money at it. And then as we go through this and we see these things being used, I've said before, Sun Tzu once said, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And I tend to believe that's what's going on here, because, again, the numbers I'm looking at here, one of the outlets I listened to regarding Ukraine said the Russians over the next year are going to produce 1,500 tanks, new, not even going into the reserves there. And so that's like 3 tank armies of worth of stuff. And then Ukraine has no hope of matching that. So, Doug, how is it the people? And then as we're speaking today, Bakhmut is finally fallen, I think, pretty much. And yet somehow people interpret that as, oh, no, the Ukrainians are wearing down the Russians. Like, okay, how is it we're so far apart on what's going on versus what the media is saying about this?
Well, it goes back to your original comment. You talked about emotion.
Yeah.
And people in Washington don't think, they emote.
Yeah.
And as soon as this began, there were all sorts of utterly false, misleading assumptions made. But the most important thing is everybody emoted and said, oh, this is a wonderful opportunity to wear down and harm and punish Russia. And ultimately, we can force a regime change. We can destroy their economy. So we'll sweep Russia away, the last obstacle to denationalizing Europe, opening borders, importing migrants from Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. We can totally destroy Russia, as we have had so much success destroying much of Europe and, oh, by the way, our own country.
Yeah.
Well, there were problems with those assumptions and goals, but people emoted. And now you're asking them to step forward and say, gosh, we were wrong. Our assumptions were flawed. No one in Washington ever admits that they're wrong. And they hope that ultimately, when this fails, and it will, and it falls apart, that, we'll walk away and they can turn to the media that is obedient to their orders and say, change the subject.
Right.
Let's talk about something else, and hope that the American electorate forgets, because Americans are very good at forgetting what they don't care to remember.
Right.
So, it really is emotion in the worst possible way.
Well, to that point, Doug, I mean, we've only got about a minute left if I have to go to stop our first half here, is the fact that so much of what you just laid out is essentially a policy that will result in catastrophic failure, not only of our military strategy, but of our economy, because so much of what's going on right now is damaging. I mean, the more you have to pay to a third country, you fund all this, you're taking loans out, you're devaluing the dollar, you're actually, all this quantitative easing. Doug, I don't think people fully understand how much all this printing of money is damaging their own wealth. And
well, you realize, Tony, that effectively happened after the Vietnam War. That LBJ managed to do the same kind of damage. And the damage was so severe that Nixon took us off the gold standard.
Right. I remember that.
If we had remained on the gold standard, we would have eventually had to default. So he took us off, which allowed us to, quote unquote, print money. But we were also a different nation. We had a large manufacturing base that we had not yet exported overseas. We had a large population of skilled labor, and they had people that wanted to work. And we were very homogenous, and we were still very nationalistic.
Right.
You put all those things together. Now let's look at the United States today. That country is gone. We live in a very different country. So the problem is that, yes, we are going to confront financial collapse. It's coming. It's nearer than most Americans realize. And when it strikes, suddenly everything that's happening beyond the borders of the United States will become meaningless.
So
and we will focus here at home.
Yeah.
God help Washington when that starts.
That was an interview we had with Doug MacGregor. We were talking about his newest book, Margin of Victory.